Hello, it's Jacqueline Limoges again, welcoming you to week 5 of the ethics course. I just want to pause and speak to you about the very difficult work that you've been undertaking in the last 4 weeks of the course. There's been very heavy reading, very heavy content, very abstract ideas, and I know that you've been persevering to work through this content, and I congratulate you on that. I'm hoping that you're all caught up on the readings, because what we've done in the last 4 weeks is we've laid down a foundation for you for ethical reasoning and ethical decision making. You might recall that a few weeks ago I mentioned that all of the various students studying for the different health professions all take an ethics course. So it's very important for you to have the language of ethics, to understand these different approaches, philosophies, frameworks, so that you can have equal participation in ethical decision making as a member of the interdisciplinary healthcare team. If you can imagine hundreds of students from across North America walking their way to an ethics class or signing in online to study ethics, you're participating in what is a shared body of knowledge for the health disciplines. You've also come to realize, I'm sure, in the last few weeks, that ethics has its particular body of knowledge, and that as nurses we've used some of that knowledge and tried to make it our own through some of the ways that we apply ethics. And this takes us really to what we're going to be doing for the remaining of the class. So the Canadian Nurses Association created a code of ethics and revised it in 2008. And we'll be spending the next several weeks working through the individual value statements and trying to work together to understand how we can use the 4 weeks of content that we've discussed about the various ethical approaches, the law, different theories, different philosophies, and how we can work with those ideas and our own distinct body of knowledge as registered nurses. So there's still much work to be done, but I think that you'll find now that the groundwork that you've done in the first 4 weeks, you'll increasingly have an ease with the application of those ideas as we move through, as you participate in the various learning activities that have been set out for you, and as you practice with the case studies. So let's jump into week 5 content then. So this slide sets out the goals for the week. And one of the main activities that we're going to do is we're going to discuss how to use decision-making models and frameworks. So there are a number of different models. Your textbook, the Oberle and Raffen-Buchel textbook, has a model. And I'm going to also present to you Jan Storch's model for ethical decision-making and mention a few others. We're going to then discuss and explore the Canadian Nurses Association Code of Ethics, the value statement number 1, which is providing safe, compassionate, competent, and ethical care, and the various parts that make up this value. We're going to explore ways to assess and to develop your own needs within this value statement. We're going to discuss some of the readings of the week, and we're going to understand and problematize how the social structures within healthcare and nursing shape and influence our ideas about this value, and at times limit our autonomy as nurses to practice as we believe we should. And lastly, we're going to examine the idea or the concept of ethical fitness, and we'll talk about how this is achieved. Okay, let's get to work on our first learning goal for the week. So what is a decision-making framework? Well, you already have a fair bit of experience with decision-making frameworks. For example, in semester 3, you were using a decision-making framework or a practice framework by Patterson and Zarad called Call and Response. And so you already have experience with the benefits and the pitfalls of using a framework to organize practice and organize decision-making. What we have come to understand in professional practice is that a systematic approach ensures that thorough thinking and thorough knowledge application occurs. And so when we're faced with an ethical dilemma, the view is that when we use a decision-making framework, it can guide our analysis and it can help us to find solutions. I'm sure you recall me saying a few times now that with ethical reasoning, the view is that it's not necessarily our first thought, but our last thought that is the best one. When something is an ethical dilemma, usually there's a high degree of complexity. It's often a very emotionally charged and a very difficult situation. And the view is that applying a decision-making framework assists us to use the principles of ethical decision making, to use the various philosophies and our discipline-specific knowledge. So becoming comfortable with a decision-making framework is very important for professional practice. We have to be able to justify our actions. That's what we give in exchange for the rights to be a self-regulated profession. And the decision-making framework assists us in being able to justify and offer the rationale for our thinking, our decisions, and our actions. So the decision-making framework allows us to reflect on the elements within ethical reasoning. Each step of the model is influenced by and influences the other steps, and by ethical theories, approaches, and philosophies. And we can see that sometimes we move forward in a decision-making framework, and we, through that process, develop greater clarity on the issues, and we sometimes have to move back a couple of steps. So it really is not a linear process necessarily, but more one where we're constantly evaluating and constantly reflecting on whether our actions and beliefs are contributing to the good. So really, the models are all directed towards the goal of acting in the patient's best interest. There are a number of frameworks. I'm going to present two of them to you today, and of course you're welcome to search out other frameworks. And for example, there's a McDonald model that is quite commonly used in nursing, and there are many other frameworks of which you're welcome to go and explore and discuss here in the online forums. But really, we use frameworks for ethical decision-making to promote us to take into account ethical issues, ethical models and theories, the influence of the micro and the macro context, and to really be able to explore the social, relational, and power issues inherent in the ethical dilemma. You'll notice that while there are different models, they do all share similar traits based on what it is that the framework for ethical decision-making is trying to help us achieve. So frameworks all help us to examine ethics problems in a systematic way. They're all designed with the hope of helping us to make the best decision and to be able to reflect on our actions. The frameworks help us to consider the everyday ethics in the choices that we make, the everyday ethics in the relationships that we form and the relationships that we don't form, and it helps us to consider how we ought to be with others. It helps us to consider issues of competence. If you recall, Aristotle talked about the technical and the clinical and the ethical, and the need to make sure that the two are in balance. And the frameworks can also help us understand our moral distress. There are times in the work of nurses that things are very challenging and very chaotic. In both of the journal readings for this week, issues of moral distress were raised, and the intent of giving you these readings is for you to begin to anticipate some of the issues that you may face as registered nurses, and also to begin to sensitize you to the kinds of experiences you might be having in practice, and to realize that you're not alone. When we conduct research studies looking at nurses' moral distress or ethical practice, we see a lot of commonalities, and in some ways that brings solace to us in knowing that it's not necessarily us, but it's the social organization of our work or healthcare. Okay, so here is the first decision-making model or framework, and it's the one that comes from your textbook, the Oberle and Raffen-Buchel textbook. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this model because I think that there's a fair bit in the textbook that explains it, and I think that through your reading you'll be able to grasp this model fairly quickly. As well, in the textbook there are several case studies, and then the analysis of the case study follows this framework for ethical decision making. So basically what Oberle and Raffen-Buchel are asking us to do when using their framework is that we use the first step, which is assessing the ethics of the situation, asking us to look at the relationships, the goals, the beliefs, and the values that each person involved in the situation has. Then the model asks us to reflect on and to review potential actions. So recognizing available choices and how those choices are valued. One of the key issues that we've been striving for is that when we're trying to resolve an ethical dilemma or when we're trying to work in the patient's best interest, it is important that we explore as many options as possible. The more we have to choose from, the more likely we'll be able to offer options to our patients and thus come up with a decision that everyone is satisfied with. Nursing is an action and is a practice discipline. Therefore, at some point, we have to select an ethical action. We have to do something. This is not purely philosophy. We have to be able to turn this into an actionable endeavor, and that we select an action that we feel is maximizing the good. We engage in that action, and then, as is always the case, we reflect on and review the ethical actions. We ensure that the outcomes that were achieved are actually maximizing the good and that we are actually working in the patient's best interest. The Storch model, it is similar to the Oberle and Raffen-Buchel model, but as I've mentioned, it's a model that many of us prefer. We find it a little bit more comprehensive and a little bit easier to work with. In the course documents section, you'll see that there are additional notes pertaining to the ethical decision-making guideline. I think it bears reminding that Storch is the Canadian ethicist. She now works in British Columbia, and she's been very involved in narrative ethics, so coming to understand the patient's story. So what you'll see in her model then is this idea of connecting with the other as a key part of ethical decision making. So the first step to the model is that we talk with all the parties involved. From that conversation, there should emerge central story. We should really be able to understand why this is an issue for the patients. What is the meaning and significance for the patient and his or her family? We use that dialogue to learn about the patient's medical status and their expectations that they have as a result of their current experience. It's also important that we gather non-medical information about the social conditions, the family roles, the relationships, quality of life, and power dynamics in the situation. And what we're trying to do here is develop as deep an understanding of the person's lived experience as possible. We also ensure that we determine the level of competency and capacity of the patient to ensure that they are in fact able to speak for themselves. So once we have a good understanding of the person's lived experience and the lived experience of his or her family, we begin to move into a process here in this diagram on the left-hand corner, where we begin to clarify the values and the beliefs and the expectations. The next then, at the top of the circle, is that we begin to consider the ethical principles involved. So which principles might be most important in this situation, and are some of the principles in conflict with others? Then Storch would have us look at the social expectations and the legal requirements. Is there an institutional history on a similar situation? Have others before you faced this? How did they handle it? What groundwork has already been laid? What are the policies? What are the legal provisions? We've spent quite a bit of time last week talking about the law and how the law can both help and constrain us in ethical practice. And not unlike the Oberle, Raffen-Buchel is that we develop now here in the lower right-hand corner a range of actions, and we think about the variety of actions and their possible consequences. We consider whether the potential actions are ethically acceptable, whether they're legal, whether they're permissible in our current society or institution. And from the range of potential actions, we try to build consensus around which actions is the most fitting for that situation. So you'll see here in Storch's model, it's very much based on consensus, very much based on relationship, as opposed to the idea that there is a debate. So it really is about people giving and taking and trying to resolve the problem in such a way that everyone is satisfied and that people's needs are met. And lastly, we actually enact the actions, and then we have to review, because sometimes our best intentions or our carefully laid out plans actually deliver consequences that were unexpected. So again, there's this fluidity and this back and forth within the model to ensure that we're constantly reflecting and evaluating and ensuring that our actions are in fact contributing to ethical practice and contributing to good. Okay, so those are two examples of models or frameworks for decision making. And really what is left to you now is to begin to practice using these models for decision making in the case study activities that we have for the course. Ultimately, your paper that you write for this course requires you to use a decision making framework. And you'll be asked to do similar kinds of activities in the exam. And then in real life, using a systematic approach is thought to be one of the ways that we can ensure ethical practice. So that takes us through that portion of the class. And now we're going to switch gears a little bit. So as I mentioned, the Canadian Nurses Association created a code of ethics for registered nurses. And their intent in developing this code was to make the values that nurses are expected to uphold clear, and to inform the public of what to expect from nurses. The side benefit of this is that it tells people who are thinking of entering nursing what to expect. So in the next few weeks, as I discuss the various value statements within the Code for Ethics, if you increasingly see that this does not represent your views and your values, and you start to feel tensions and disjunctures, it gives you an opportunity to really reflect, is nursing the best profession for you? Okay, here's one of my crazy PowerPoint slides that I tried to give a visual representation of the value statement. So as I mentioned, the first value statement is providing safe, compassionate, competent, and ethical care. And really, value one is the foundation of practice. I think that the other value statements in a way fall beneath this, because if we are providing safe, compassionate, competent care, it is in many ways then ethical care. It falls out of that. So basically, where do we get our ideas about nursing competence? We discussed last week that we have standards for practice, we have expectations for continuing competence, and we have the law and professional competence. So we have really clear ideas, and they're documented and they're experienced about what is nursing competence. You will probably notice as you enter practice that the ideas of competence vary from person to person and from institution to institution. And sometimes ideas can be in conflict with one another, but there are key elements that sort of transcend the institution's idea of competence, your idea of competence, the professional body's idea of competence. And it's those areas that transcend that help us to define nursing competence. There's quite a strong emphasis now on safety as a moral obligation, and we're recognizing that hospitals are not as safe as they once were, and so really focusing our attention to minimize harm is quite important. So for example, we know right now that there are very large numbers of medication errors happening in practice. And so it's our moral obligation to look at practice patterns and to work with the interdisciplinary team to promote safety and to minimize harm. The whole idea of compassion and compassionate care requires us to recognize the pain and suffering of another and to be prepared to do something about it. It requires us to be present, to be aware, and to really recognize that what we do can cause or worsen the suffering of another. And so we work with the intent of compassion. It ensures that we're really maintaining the integrity and promoting the integrity of the other. And the last portion of this is the ethical. And we'll talk later in this presentation about this idea of ethical fitness. The chapter does a really nice job of describing ethical fitness, and this is part of our ongoing competence. And it's an ongoing process for us to really reflect on our abilities, our knowledge, our attitudes, our compassion, our views on safety, to determine if we really are fit to practice. And then it also brings us into this whole wave of knowledge that's currently being generated in the literature around preventative ethics. And the Pavlish article that I asked you to read for this week highlights this notion of preventative ethics and gives us ideas of where ethical conflict arises. And so we know then when we're heading into certain situations, there is a high likelihood that there will be an ethical dilemma. And when we consider this, it allows us to create courses of action that can help prevent the conflicts from happening in the first place. And all of this idea, being able to provide safe, compassionate, competent, and ethical care, requires us to have that background knowledge of ethics theories, the kind of knowledge that we've been laying down in the last few weeks. But it also requires us to have an attitude of openness so that we can have ethical sensitivity and moral agency, so that we have a sense that we can notice what's happening and a belief that we can actually do something about it. So this value statement is very consistent with the view that all professional standards in Canada, from province to province, all of the various colleges of nurses, all of the standards require nurses to promote good practice, prevent poor practice, and to intervene with unacceptable practices. So we discussed last week that it really is not a choice that we have. If we observe a colleague practicing in a way that is unsafe or that is harmful or promoting suffering, we have an obligation to intervene. Okay, let's pull some of these ideas apart then. As you noticed in value statement number 1, there are a variety of components to that value statement. And the first one that we'll look at is the issue of competence. It would be quite interesting for you to develop, grab a sheet of paper, and at the top of the sheet of paper, on one side, put what you view as competence, and on the other side, put what the institution where you're currently doing practicum views as competence. For example, you might think that being able to form a relationship with your patient and engaging in individual assessments and individual activities is central to your idea of competence. And you might notice, on the other hand, that the institution, for example, views speed as a key element of competence. And being able to recognize the tensions and disjunctures between what you view as competent and what the institution views as competent is important for you to be able to reconcile these differences and to recognize that perhaps there are multiple definitions of competence and maybe there are some parts that you need to maintain for your autonomous practice. So broadly speaking, competence really is viewed as the integration of knowledge, skill, abilities, and judgment in enacting care. Without competence, it's viewed that mistakes will happen and that patients may be harmed or may suffer. If nurses are to know what good practice looks like, then nursing practice standards must include a list of competency statements. And for example, through your education program, as you well know, there are 123 national core competencies, and our whole education program is based around helping you develop competency within these 123 statements. So what is competence and how do we remain competent? So as previously stated, the idea of competence is the knowledge, skill, abilities, and judgments. And so this means that safe care has to include both knowledge and the psychomotor skills and the use of technology, but it also requires us to have the ability to work with others, to form relationships. And inherent in this idea of competence is that there is a need for continuing competence. We know that the knowledge that we're teaching you is what we know now, but that knowledge is constantly expanding, and it is our responsibility to ensure that we maintain competence across our lifetime of working as a nurse. So when we take on the rights and responsibilities of being a nurse, we take on certain obligations as well. I've been discussing this back and forth, this give and take that we have with our ability to be a self-regulated profession and with our ability to hold ourselves out and call ourselves registered nurses. And so our competence obligations is that we strive for the highest quality of care possible. We strive to be technically and clinically competent, and we have to recognize our own level of competence and to do something about it when we realize that we're falling a little bit below standard. We have to understand our own values and how they enter into and influence the practice. of nurses and of ourselves. In last semester's language, that would have been your angular view. We have to constantly work toward minimizing harm and to take preventative or corrective actions to protect patients from unsafe, incompetent, or unethical care. So my question to you at this point is, what are you doing as a student to ensure that you're meeting your competence obligations? If you're constantly working, at a below average level, are you actually positioning yourself to be able to adequately demonstrate competence? There are nurses and nursing scholars, for example, Patricia Benner, who talked about how we develop competence and how we move from novice to expert. Certainly we would expect to see that a brand new graduate nurse would have a different level of competence than a seasoned nurse of 20 years. And what Benner suggests that it does take about 2 years of working in an area for the novice to become competent. And that's a long time, and in these intensified working conditions, it can be very difficult for nurses to reconcile the expectations that the institution has of their practice and what they're actually capable to deliver. Okay, so the next component of the value statement then is safety. So what is safety? And I think one of the key areas that we have to sort of pause and think about is that harm can be subjective. There are a variety of influences to what we would decide makes us feel safe or unsafe. There are value statements, there are cultural beliefs, religious beliefs, and we used to think solely of safety being in the physical realm, but we now know that there is spirit harm, spirit injury. There's a great deal of hurt that comes from marginalization and social exclusion, harm to a person's dignity or self-worth. And so we've really expanded our view about what is safe. And I think that certainly in first year, and we'll do a little bit more work on this in this course, is this notion of cultural safety, and really ensuring that the interactions that we have with others are helping people to maintain their dignity and self-worth. It's interesting to return to Aristotle's idea about the technical and the ethical. And safety really is, a moral obligation. It really is a professional obligation, and it's a knowledge-based obligation. And we really have the need to minimize harm and potential harm to people. And we know that some of the things that we do have inherent harm to them. We know that surgery or various procedures that we do actually are painful. And so it is our obligation to ensure that we are providing pain medication, for example, or that we are respectful of difference and of religious practices and the timing of various activities. The ideas that we presented a couple of weeks ago now about relational ethics is an approach that can help us to resolve some of the tensions that exist between differences in values and cultural beliefs. And safety is also a concept that relates to us as nurses in our work setting. We know that nurses experience quite a bit of violence in the workplace, violence from each other in terms of bullying and uncooperative practices, but also violence from patients and their families. And so we really have to be willing to examine our own contribution to violence in the workplace. And I would ask you to look at how you're contributing to violence in your clinical setting, in the classroom setting. How are we creating a safe space so that everyone can learn? And there are very real threats that are just inherent in our work. And we also have an obligation to minimize those risks as best as we can. An example of workplace safety that I think is quite interesting. A couple of years ago now, there was a gas explosion in Toronto. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. It was quite dramatic. And there was a nurse working in the community with a child who was quite disabled, and her parents were also disabled. And when the explosion happened, the nurse actually abandoned her patients. And I will put a copy of the discipline hearing that happened for this nurse in the course documents for you to be able to read about what happened to this nurse, and to recognize that we have an obligation and we have an expectation beyond that of the regular public, because we're working with patients who rely on us. Okay, so we're moving right along now to the next element, which is compassion. What is compassion? Compassion is used to reduce or avoid suffering. It's being able to recognize, hear, and respond to the potential harm or suffering or pain of another. When we're compassionate, it's because we are aware that we can cause or relieve suffering. So compassion is the desire to do something about another's suffering. It's recognizing that we understand the person's lived experience, we're in relation with that other, and that we're entering into and trying to work with that person in their best interest so that we can promote respect and dignity. So nursing scholars have been trying to help us understand the nature of compassion. The view is that when we understand a phenomena, when we understand the components or the parts that make up a phenomena, we can begin to use that knowledge for reflective practice, we can use that knowledge for growth and development, and we can use that knowledge to direct our care. So van der Singel in 2011 conducted a study with older people with chronic diseases and looked at how the nurses displayed compassion. And out of this study came the short list that I'm presenting here, that some of the components of compassion were attentiveness, listening, confronting, this whole attitude of being present, an attitude of wanting to be involved and of helping. So we can see here through this study that the nurses really worked to understand the lived experience of the other, and that the patients actually felt that the nurses were working to understand their situation and their suffering, and that the suffering was in fact a trigger for compassion. So this is just one study, and there are many others, but if compassion is part of ethical care, it's in our best interest to understand what is compassion and how can we develop that within ourselves, and how can we look at our compassionate practice when there are so many competing areas for our time and attention. Okay, and then what is ethical care? Ethical care is really about how we make choices, about how we behave or act in a certain situation. So we can choose an ethical course of action, or we can choose a course of action that promotes harm or suffering or not paying attention to the patient's best interest. So ethical care is about actively making choices and behaving in certain ways that promote the good. If you've not already done so, can you please press pause and watch the 2 clips that I've placed for you in the resources for week number 5. These 2 YouTube clips are about the culture of safety and the culture of harm reduction. And what I'm trying to show you through this clip is that it really is a culture. It really is shared meaning and understanding about this idea that either promotes or hinders. And we have certain ideas that make it difficult for us to enact this value statement. And I think that on the surface, we would all agree that we want to provide safe, compassionate, competent, and ethical care. But when it comes right down to it, it's sometimes actually a little harder to do this than we might hope it would be. And I think it's interesting for you to constantly reflect on your own practice settings and to see the social organization of work and how it can actually impede us to be able to fulfill this value statement. So have a look at the two clips and then come back and join the PowerPoint, please. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the last goal for this week, which is looking at ethical fitness. So ethical fitness is an important idea to consider. So we've been talking about competence as being the ability to integrate knowledge, skill, and judgment, and we've been talking about ethical practice as an active process of making choices that contribute to the good. And so to be able to practice in what is a very complex healthcare scenario, it's important that we are ethically fit. Storch says that to be ethically fit is to be mentally engaged in the human activity of ethical reflection and justification. So it requires knowledge and skill in ethical problem solving, becoming or being a good person of good character. We can see the influence of Aristotle here. Engaging in ethical conduct, being able to make the decision to do the difficult course of action. Working towards building a moral community, recognizing that you are part of the system in which you work, and taking action and contributing to the moral community is a key part of that. And listening to your own voice, recognizing when you feel tensions, when you feel distress, and when something is not quite right, and being prepared to do something about it. The quote that I like that connects to ethical fitness is Mahatma Gandhi's: "The human voice can never reach the distance that is covered by the still, small voice of conscience." We typically know what is right and what is good. And if we can listen to that small voice, that small conscience, and to pay attention to it and act on it, there is a sense that we would be building a stronger moral community. So the chapter reading for this week talks about the foundation for ethical fitness. And the view is that ethical fitness begins with education. We have to have awareness, and the more we understand a phenomena or an experience, the more we can challenge the assumptions inherent in that. And so the view that began really in Aristotle's time is that we can learn to practice ethically. Education on ethics and ethical reasoning is based on that premise. Doan, another Canadian scholar, suggests to educators that they develop an educational approach that helps students to consider ethics as a way of being, more than just a code to follow. And I think that the value statements from the CNA helps us to understand that it's just not a series of steps that we do. And I think there's a movement away from the deontological perspective when we think of ethics and ethical fitness in this way. It's overly simplistic to think that we can just always follow our duty, because as nurses we fully recognize that sometimes there's a competition and tensions between our duty, and that actually carrying out a certain course of action will have detriments for others. So it's recognizing the complexity in the situation and being able to consider a way of moving through that. The other part of ethical fitness is this idea of moral distress. There's a growing interest in scholarship that looks at moral distress. We know that as nurses work in industrialized work settings and intensified work settings where the workload is very heavy, we know that a lot of nurses are finding a lot of constraints to their ability to practice autonomously and to practice in the patient's best interest. So moral distress arises when we know the right course of action. So it's not a dilemma. We know what needs to happen, but we can't act on this understanding. So an example is a palliative patient who needs nursing care, but there's insufficient time to provide it. So we know that the nursing care would promote dignity and ease suffering, but we're not able to carry out those actions because of the tensions and the pull on our time to conduct so much work in a given shift. There's an excellent example on page 94 of the Oberle and Raffen-Buchel book that illustrates this idea. So moral distress is an important concept to consider when we consider ethical fitness. There are times that our distress is so high, it's difficult for us to practice in an ethically fit way. And so being able to find equilibrium is important in our work. Pavlish is the article, Pavlish et al. Is one of the articles that I asked you to read for this week. And they discuss moral distress as a disequilibrium. It's a negative state. And it's again when we know what needs to happen, but we can't follow through with our decisions. So in the Trying It On section on page 97 of Oberle and Raffen, have a look and see there's both moral distress and ethics cases that you can use to help understand this concept. One of the reasons that I chose the Pavlish article for the reading this week is that it does give us information on this idea of preventative ethics. So again, when we recognize that we're heading into a zone that is charged, it can assist us to prepare ourselves mentally and physically to be able to manage the situation in a way that promotes the good for all. We know that proactive interventions are typically more effective and less wearying than reactive ones. So Pavlish identified areas such as palliative care, where the goals of care are discussed openly and honestly as care changes from cure to comfort, as an area that we can practice preventative ethics. When there are changes in conditions that are anticipated and changes in care are expected, again, we can move into that whole notion of preventative ethics. So if you haven't read the Pavlish et al. Article already, I would encourage you to do so. And as you read the article, think about how their work related to early indicators and risk factors for ethically difficult situations can assist you in thinking about preventative ethics. So this week in the learning activities, I'm actually giving you a choice of case studies. There's Chanel, who is a new graduate, and her situation helps us to reflect on safe, compassionate, and confident ethical care. So you can read her case study and in your team decide if you want to do Chanel's story or if you're interested in doing Mrs. McMurray's story. Mrs. McMurray's story helps us to explore issues of rights and self-determination and what are the concerns and the boundaries that confidentiality poses, and really helps us to explore the family's role in decision-making. So either case study is quite good, and if you're really ambitious, by all means do both, but I think you're only expected to do one. And I also wanted to point out to you that there are online resources to help you learn more about some of the philosophies and the theories that we've been presenting. And so please go and find those resources if you haven't already. They're in the course documents section, the learning resources. These will be very useful to you as you work through the various assignments and in particular the paper. Okay, and that concludes week 5. So please join the discussion forum, and I hope that you've enjoyed the readings for this week.